All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining one of our breakout sessions today. We're going to get started with Gleaning Insights from Civic Data. Dhillon from Socrata will be leading our session, so we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks. Is everybody having a good time at the Customer Summit? Woo! What? Just one woo? Come on. So I'm thrilled to be talking about analytics and insights. We have an amazing panel. Dr. Amin-Ra Mashariki from the Big Apple, New York City, Chief Analytics Officer and leader of the Mayor's Office on Data Analytics. Welcome, Amin-Ra. Ben, everybody heard Ben's amazing talk this morning. I don't know if you need another introduction, but you know, founder of the iQuant blog and provocateur extraordinaire.
Don't I know it? It's all in fun.
These two are buddies, that's why they sit next to each other.
Sure.
Bill Howe, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Washington and Associate Director for the East Sciences Institute. Welcome, Bill. And Carter Hewgley was at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the agency that we all know will be there when we need it most, for about 4 years, leading analytics efforts there, and is now at Johns Hopkins University for the Center of Excellence in Government, leading, helping advise cities. So with that, let's jump in. So you guys all have very different backgrounds. From the big city to the, a lot of time in a federal agency. Ben, you're very much on some levels kind of on the outside of government looking in, and Bill, you're kind of living the life every day as a professor. Talk to us, and representing that kind of university academic sort of insightful world. Tell us a little bit about how your perspectives make you fundamentally different than the people that you're sitting next to. How's that different?
I'll start. I think, as you mentioned, with New York City. New York City is just a complex space, and MODA, what we focus on doing is understanding sort of the landscape of sort of the urban landscape, understand sort of the intricacies within that urban landscape, needle in a haystack problem. So for me, what makes my job particularly complex and different is that, one, we have to know everything. So when there are challenges, we have to understand Department of Buildings' business model and processes. We have to understand the Department of Health's business models and processes. We have to understand every single agency and what they do. And then we also have to be on the ground for emergencies. So we're on the ground for, MODA was on the ground for Sandy when we thought Joaquin was coming to hit. So my office is putting together a risk management profile and analytic suite for Department of Buildings. We think Joaquin is coming to hit. We all have to get pulled into preparedness meetings, right? And so we have to be able to switch on a dime to be able to understand different facets of the city. And we just don't have, and the mayor pushes out an initiative and he wants pre-K students to enroll in free pre-K. We have to be able to understand what that problem and challenges like. So we just don't have the luxury of sort of focusing on any one particular thing. We have to be ready to think about everything within the city and that needle in a haystack problem within the city, and we have to do it 24 hours. Our job on Saturday, and I think Claire's in the room, Socrata was very helpful with some things that we needed on Saturday, and so we have to be a 24-hour, 7 days a week organization.
Great.
Should I go next? Or
yeah, we're all looking. Just jump in. I don't think just because we're lined up in a line.
I think we're pretty similar in that my background being at FEMA, you had to know, in the role that I had, you had to know a little bit about everything in the agency. But I think the difference between perhaps the other panelists is that my experience has been mostly in infusing information into a crisis situation where it is moving so fast that very few people have time to wait for any in-depth analysis, that whatever you're doing has to move at the pace of the events that are unfolding, or else you're going to miss your opportunity to inform those events. And that can sometimes be a political crisis, not just an emergency. Sometimes government leadership really doesn't have the luxury of waiting before they have to make a choice about going this way or that way. And so repeatedly, I've been in opportunities to witness sort of what that's like and where you get some hits and misses. The other thing I think at the federal level is you're watching this giant battleship get steered slightly 2 degrees to the left when in like in the private sector it seems like you can turn directions immediately. So being able to sort of move a giant ship has been an interesting challenge.
Cool. Bill, what about you from the university?
So from the university's perspective, there's this traditional role of universities that has this dual mission of research and teaching, and I really think there's this third mission that's emerging, which is bringing this work out into the world and applying it. And in the space of civic tech and urban science, this is a great place to do this. This eScience Institute that I lead with Ed Lazowska, part of the goal here is to do kind of a broad campus-wide social engineering experiment where we try to bring data-intensive science to be the norm rather than the exception. And so we are hiring people with this background. We're trying to steal people back from technology instead of sending them out. We try to bring them back in to spend time working on this kind of work. And that's across all fields. Astronomy and oceanography is where we sort of cut our teeth. And we started making a concerted effort in social sciences, in particular in urban science and civic tech, in part because there's enormous demand among students to participate in those things. We ran this Data Science for Social Good program, which is we borrowed the name and some other things with permission from the University of Chicago and combined it with some of our own programs. But we had 144 applicants for 16 slots over the summer, from astrophysics to criminology to statistics to computer science. And if we had done data science for microbiology, we wouldn't have had that kind of a turnout. So there's an enormous interest on campus, and there's an increasing demand to sort of embrace our role as kind of an anchor institution in Seattle and really participate more broadly in policy change. So that's something I've been excited about trying to foster.
Cool.
Me.
Yeah, sure.
I guess you labeled me a provocateur, but I guess I somehow have landed in this sort of advocacy role accidentally when I started getting into this about 1.5 years ago, and saw, would go to these civic tech meetups and see the sheer percentage of people working on PDF parsing. And watching all these really passionate young people spending hours and hours, weeks and months just turning data that government had released from PDF into machine ingestible. And that struck me. I was like, how are we taking our most engaged citizens and having them take data that's been released and making it usable? And that's kind of partly why I've started to kind of point some of this out across the board. Luckily, there's a lot of great counterparts within government, obviously right next to me, as well as the DOITT in New York City. So there's a lot going on. I think from the outside, I guess my extra challenge is that I don't know what's going on, and I'm not supposed to know what's going on. So when something's not happening, is it for privacy reasons? Is it political? Is it technological? And that's not always transparent from the outside. And so I work to try to figure that out. I think when you're on the inside, you have a better context, which maybe is more settling. You understand from the outside, you can complain, but you don't really understand what's going on. I would love more transparency on some of that, so that the community can kind of understand those delays. But it's a unique viewpoint because of the lack of information, which once again makes sense, but creates some tension, I think.
Cool. And so just kind of along those lines, when I guess the question I would have is sort of something around process. If you can kind of help folks understand better, what is it that how do you approach analytics problems and insight problems? How do you and folks within your organizations, how do you think about, how much time do you spend, really, how much is it of it spent accessing data, formatting it, getting it in the right ability to kind of massage it, and then how much of it's spent actually doing some analysis, maybe building models, that kind of thing, how much is spent doing development, and how much is spent actually deploying and operationalizing it and getting in the hands of folks so they can actually make decisions. How does that break down? Is it really just 90% data wrangling, as we oftentimes hear in data science, or are you finding that maybe that's not so much the case?
So it's funny because working with statisticians, and I'm a computer scientist, and working with people who are really, truly smart with math, I try to stay away from percentages because they make absolutely no sense whatsoever. But I will say, at least when I use percentages, they make no sense. At MODA, what we like to refer to ourselves as data therapists. So we actually sit with agencies and talk to them about their processes and we have weekly meetings, daily oftentimes, and talk to them about what they do. So before we even look at a stitch of their data, look at models, think about models, before we do anything of the sort, we sit there with pen and paper and we go over their process. Right now, I have a team in New York City who's at Rikers Island. I always joke that I spent all of my life, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, spent all of my life away from Rikers Island. As soon as I moved to New York City, they want me to go to Rikers Island. But that's because the Department of Corrections said, hey, can we work with you? And the first thing that we said was, let's go to Rikers Island and understand what you do and how you do it on a daily basis. So we actually spend a lion's share of our time engaging our clients. And what happens is MODA, we function not unlike 18F out here in Washington, D.C., where they don't go looking for problems. People have to go and present. The agencies, the federal agencies have to say, here are some things that we're working on. Can you help? And so MODA doesn't take on problems that it thinks up. Agencies have to come to us and say, here's a challenge that we're seeing in our everyday processes, and we want to make those processes smarter and more efficient. Can you help us? Can you use data, our data and other data in the city, to help us do that? And so we work with agencies, and we have a very agile process where we sort of do descriptive, predictive, and then sometimes prescriptive analytics. So the first thing is, let's put this on a map, or let's do some regression analysis and have you see, you know, exactly what's going on. I think Ben and I did another talk before, and we talked about quality of the data. And I always say that we don't assume that the quality of data that we get from agencies is the quality that we would need to run really strong analytics. So therefore, the back and forth, a consistent and a quick turnaround of analytic data that they give to us and analytics that we push out help us understand quality of the data. So it's a very, we talk, and we discuss, and we're data therapists for a particularly long time, and then it's quick sprints around.
Do you find that, like if you're following a particular problem, like, you know, the famous kind of grease in the sewer traps problem, do you find that you have to kind of walk into different agencies to even get the data that, you know, might be kind of the candidate predictive correlates or something for some of these more insights generating problems? Or do you find, like, you know, in general, your kind of top-down approach of having certain classes of data emerge is sufficient?
I think yes. The answer is yes, that we do find that, well, one, MODA has gotten robust enough where we understand. One of the things that, the first thing I did when I started here was hire up a very aggressive and courageous and curious team of data scientists and analysts. And so they spend a lot of time understanding, and even before they took the job, understanding what data existed in the city, not unlike how Ben and other Civic folks do. So we already have a good understanding, and we're robust enough to have already seen a lot of data. Yeah. What we do is city data doesn't just exist with city agencies, right? You have nonprofit organizations, you have groups.
State and federal data.
That's right, the state and federal data. We get a lot of stuff from
nonprofits.
And so that stored data that's helpful for the city. And so we do, you know, so for instance, if we're doing a homeless problem, we'll go to the shelters because they're storing information about what's going on around homelessness and placing folks in beds. We don't have to just go to DHS. We can go to shelters and engage them through DHS, of course. So that's sort of a type of engagement.
What about you, Ben, like with respect to getting data? I mean, because sometimes it seems like you kind of pull on a thread and then you kind of keep pulling. Right. Like, do you find yourself like getting pulled into the FOIA process to get the data you need? Or
it's interesting. So it's not always clear what the data is I need, and I guess that's because I approach things two ways. And I think this is maybe quite common, but one is sort of this hypothesis-driven approach, which is very much what is going on, I guess, at MODA, where, hey, look, we have this problem. Can you help us solve it, right? Which gets an entire class of problems, and maybe those are the most important problems in the end of the day. Hey, we need to reduce crime. We need to reduce response times. Like, these are very clear problems and have data sets to explore. But I also sometimes wager into the, hey, here's data. What can this data just tell us? Like, what is in here that's interesting? And the advantage, I think they're both important, but the advantage to doing that, there's some downsides, which is you can trick yourself and you think you see things that you don't, and that's not good. But the upside is it helps you find problems that you didn't know you were to look for. So, you know, no one came and said, hey, find me the parking spot that's got the most, you know. These are not important problems, but they could be just as easily. You could, you know, the way you pay for taxis. These are small things that no one set out to solve.
But how much of that is like convenience because the data's there?
Fully, right.
And how much of it is just, you know, like really what you
set
out to do that in the ideal world?
Right. So that's the point. In these cases, it's convenience. The data is public. You can actually look at it, and when it's not, you don't even know to ask for it because you don't know what you're looking for. So getting the data out there creates a whole genre of new problems that you could solve. And I would say that to your earlier question about how much time you spend, yeah, I mean, cleaning and understanding data is probably in the same way you're out at the agencies. I'm sort of reading up as well and understanding what this data is, and that's a large part of the whole process. That and cleaning, obviously.
Cool. Let's maybe jump a little bit. Carter or Bill, can you guys maybe talk to us a little bit about some big failures that you've seen out there? I know there's this saying in the startup world: fail fast, fail often. And in government, there's this massive hesitancy to embrace a statement like that. Because it's kind of a conservative industry by nature. Like from your guys' vantage, have you had a hypothesis, then the data just totally doesn't back it, and you had to back down, or like what's the biggest kind of most insightful failure that you've experienced?
A failure at FEMA? I don't know what you're talking about. So I think one of the most sort of enlightening moments that I had in the last few years was working on the unaccompanied minor children issue, which is not a normal thing that FEMA would get involved with because the Customs and Border Patrol normally handles that. But because we're in the Department of Homeland Security and we do crisis management, we understand how no matter what's happening, you could organize people and information to communicate with each other. We took on the role of sort of coordinating between the Customs and Border Patrol Agency and Health and Human Services. So Customs picks them up, Health and Human Services places them in appropriate care. And what we saw immediately was like, these are two totally different information systems. They don't talk to each other at all. By the grace of God, there was a unique identifier for each student. So we were able to sort of build from scratch we called it sort of a scrubbing tool that could look at information from both sides and be like, okay, this kid is stuck in a bottleneck in this process that nobody's catching because they're not looking at it that way. The failure, so it was a great example of like, wow, look what FEMA is capable of producing when we put smart people and technology to a problem. The failure was nobody had time to use it. Nobody had time to sort of change the way they did business because it was crisis mode. And then the crisis sort of went away. And it's hard when you solve a problem because it's a crisis to get people to keep paying attention to it when it's over. And so I didn't succeed in sort of learning from that as an organization and then channeling that into a new way of doing business across 3 federal agencies. And I just really took away from that sort of, you're not done when you do something cool, when you make a cool chart that shows you where the kids are. You're done when you've changed the way we do business the next time. So that's sort of my
that's interesting. So, like within the sort of federal emergency space, imagine there's like got to be fundamentally different modes that you're in, right? You're in like preparing for a crisis because when the crisis happens, you can't do that. So, what can be done, in that case before crises actually happen to kind of mitigate that?
I love what you said about data therapists because I think that's what, or data evangelists, you've got to be in before mode, talking about the importance of this, talking about data standards, and really helping people understand through storytelling, like here's what the value of this is going to be, because things like this are going to happen again. You're going to have a bottleneck problem. You're going to have a process flow problem. And getting people sold on those concepts through compelling stories and making it accessible and not talking about the technology the whole time, I think is how you work in preparedness mode to get people to work a little smarter when the crisis hits.
So maybe, Bill, can you talk a little bit about, and others as well, like there's this notion of, competition, right? And with respect to public sector organizations, it's very different. You're not necessarily competing. Oftentimes, the flip side of competition is partnerships. And talk about like what you look at with respect to partnering with other organizations, and where that could work out and where it couldn't. Like, how do you basically process kind of the partnership opportunity arena?
Well, so one thing I guess I will mention is that there's this circle of what's important and then sort of what's possible and what's available and sort of finding the intersection of the sweet spot there. There's this kind of annoying third circle, which is what is publishable, right? And so people start sort of rejecting very good problems because somehow they feel like, oh, well, some paper on that was written 5 years ago and therefore nothing more can be said about it. And I keep trying to, educate them that A, that you can still have impact, and B, you probably can find a place to publish it if it's important, and that impact and sort of publishability don't sort of line up. So there the competition does come up because people will sort of feel like, a space is already too well trodden, or like if it's too green field, then they don't want to go into it because no one else is working on it. But if it's too many people working in it, then they think, oh, it's already well trodden, I'll go into something else. And so we have
Goldilocks problem.
Yeah, so you have to sort of educate students that that's not really necessarily the way the real world works. The other thing where competition maybe comes up is this, tendency, I guess, in academia to, boy, that sounds like a great problem. I've got some ideas on how to solve it. 7 years from now, I'll publish my paper and then I'll tell you all about how what the answer was, right? And you have to kind of, and in the meantime, I can't tell you anything about what I did in the meantime because I've got to hoard the data and I've got to sort of keep it very careful so I don't get scooped. And of course, the chances of actually getting scooped in practice, you can sort of show there's been a bunch of studies that this basically doesn't ever happen except in very, very high competitive areas, and everybody else is sort of fooling themselves to think that someone out there is ready to steal their information. But they're this kind of idea of competition, we try to diffuse that a little bit and just talk about let's go find good problems and do the work. And students are very receptive to this, but sometimes sort of higher up the chain is a little slower.
Yeah.
I wanted to throw out along the competition line, one, do not get it confused. New York City is always in competition with every other city, period. Sports, it doesn't matter. No, but two things. One, with the civic engagement, the civic tech group, I think we play two different sides of the coin, and sometimes we engage each other in I think a particularly aggressive way, but I think those two sides of the coin are because we play the roles that we play, New Yorkers are better for it, especially in and around data, because we have a Ben Wellington in New York City challenging the government, challenging specifically even my office, and do it. New Yorkers are better for it, so we accept that sort of challenge. Also, when it comes to cities, I do think that there is supposed to be a partnership there, and I think it's the way I described it when I first started. I was a CTO at a federal agency before I came in, so I didn't have this sort of environment. But it's like a horse race, right? And so it's like playing in a PGA tournament. It's like you guys are playing against each other, but you guys are playing the PGA Tour, so you become buddies, the whole way along, but you're competing against each other always. Everyone wants to be first. You showed the Sunlight Foundation, Open Knowledge Foundation sort of census, and when Los Angeles became #1 and New York was #1 for a long time, and they immediately
Spurs competition.
So I think that competitive environment is really good. We do partner. I'm able to call a lot of chief data officers in other cities friends, because we reach out and we talk about a lot of stuff. I do think where the partnership can get stronger is where I think CRADA is beginning to go, which is this concept of cities have data and cities are storing data. When we begin to look at city data overlapping with each other, because I can talk with another analytics officer from another city and say, well, what's one of your problems? Is my problem similar? And the complexion of our cities is so different, we're never going to get it in conversation. But what if we're looking at the data? What does the data say about what are similar about our cities or dissimilar about our cities around some of the same stuff, right? And so I think we can begin to dig into the data to kind of look for those similarities. But I enjoy the competition and the engagement.
Well, let me just kind of jump in there, because you're mentioning being able to compare different cities. Ben, maybe from your vantage, have you looked at any problems where you're actually trying to compare, or are there any problems there? This is a bit of obviously there are. We know that it's really hard right now to compare across cities, at least with respect to the city-generated data. So tell us a little bit about that from your vantage.
I mean, I think maybe everyone who does this work can relate. I mean, it's not just across cities, right? Within cities, right? Being able to join information from one agency with another can be almost as challenging as across cities. So the problem is widespread, and I guess finding those standards, right? There's nothing that's the standard these days. Things are kind of moving around, and I think people are struggling with that. It makes finding insights a lot more work, and when people spend all their time normalizing data at your users, that means every user has to do it. Whereas if you find a way somehow to agree upstream, then you have a handful of people doing it for the benefit of the tens or millions of people who are using it. So you get sort of a 10,000x scaling of solving this upstream. I don't have the answers. I wish I did, but it's certainly a challenge. So.
We see this all. So I'm now working on the What Works Cities project, and almost every city we talk to, the number one thing they want to know is, what does good look like in other cities? And I'm struck by how we have sort of not succeeded yet as a society in defining that. It's for simple things like healthcare. How much does an endoscopy cost? Raise your hand if you know the average cost of an endoscopy in this country. I have no idea. I just rely on this sort of strange network of
I have no idea, but I
healthcare.
imagine that the average has a huge standard deviation.
But we all sort of are sitting here engaging in similar services all over the country that there is sort of a normal, and we haven't yet succeeded in figuring out how do we communicate what normal looks like to each other, and I think there's a huge demand for that out there.
And throwing in one thing on that was mentioned earlier about competition, which is kind of interesting. I think that one way to increase collaboration is, I mentioned earlier, but actually someone tweeted an example that was really interesting between the talks about the sharing of code and models and things. Someone just pointed me to Chicago releasing the health inspection model that helps them to decide, hey, which restaurants are most likely to have violations. That code is apparently, at least what I saw on my phone between talks, available for people to then, hey, take it home, try to make it better. Let us know if you find something cool. And not only can someone like me go home and do it, but other cities can look at this. And maybe if we see more of that, we'll see incremental improvement. So I think it's a great way to collaborate.
Cool. So one question I have, which I think is on everyone's minds, which is like, what's the single best example you've seen of really kind of fundamental insights being gleaned from data? Either something that you or your organization did, or that you've just seen out there in general in the open data community. Like maybe tell us a story about, something amazing that's happened that involved really learning something from the data.
From Motive's perspective, and we actually won a Citizens Budget Commission prize, which in New York is a big to-do, but I know outside of New York, everybody's like, what's that? But when the mayor came into office, he wanted to provide pre-K for all. And so he created a program called Pre-K for All. And so provided this mechanism for people, young children of age 4, to get free pre-K. And one of the challenges is how do you reach out to that target audience and understand and tell them this program exists for you? Because there's a lot of reasons why it's particularly difficult to reach out to certain communities, especially in New York City. And if we followed the mayoral race, the mayor sort of politicked on sort of equity. And so we had to create what we refer to as the golden record, which is, 4-year-olds don't have a internet footprint. So how do you figure out, how do you get information on what a 4-year-old does and is, and how to create that golden record and say that is a particular person, and then do outreach specifically. Okay. And so we looked at not only public data, but we also looked at private data, and we looked at we discussed internally a lot of ways that we can find a 4-year-old in the city. Who's buying diapers where, and so on and so forth. And so that was one of the more successful ways.
Cool. Bill, what about you from the
So one thing I want to maybe talk about is I'm as sort of a tech background, I'm PhDs in computer science, I'm a database guy and so forth, but I'm starting to get a greater appreciation for the contextualization, the qualitative methods that sort of need to go hand in hand with some of these methods. And this kind of came to light with a project we did over the summer, which from the 3 counties in the Seattle area who were looking at the efficacy of homelessness programs, right? So which sequences of programs tend to lead to successful exits completely, and which ones don't, and further, what are some of the other predictors of these successful exits? For example, substance abuse, or if you go into the program and you find a job while you're in the program, does that lead to a strong, a successful output? If it does, then we should focus on job training programs more so than something else. But so this went great, and we sort of people were, oh, you blew our socks off, and they're wildly impressed with the results of this, and we've done a little bit of machine learning stuff at the end. Most of it was about data wrangling, as you said. It was sort of 90% of the summer was spent on, for example, no unique identifier for individual people, but you can sort of infer if the same people, if A comes in with B and then B comes in with C, you can kind of assume that C and A are probably in the same family as well. We had to do these kinds of tricks to try to clean it up and make something sensible out of it. But despite the success, and they are sort of working on policies here, there was some comments that, like, look, when you put up some number there that says, well, substance abuse has the highest variable importance in this machine learning model and so forth. What are you actually talking about? Do you know any of these people that are trying this? Are they in recovery? Are they trying to get out of it, or are they what was their situation that sort of led them to be sort of labeled as this thing? And there's people in there that work with these people every day. And so we're trying to think about, and then we, on campus, we have people in the Department of Social Work and so forth who study these problems from a very different perspective, from a very non-quantitative perspective. And that those methods of scholarship really have a lot of value, I think, to bring life to these numbers and to sanity check what we're sort of finding. And so I think that was a good in the fact that it was successful, but it was also helped kind of open people's eyes that it's not just about sort of running these algorithms on data and reporting the results.
Great. Carter and Ben, can you be our future casters for a moment? Like, look out 10 years, like, good, solid evolutionary time, and tell us what you see. Like, what's fundamentally different about the insights-driven, approach, and is it like fundamentally intertwined with government? And what kinds of insights is it driving? What kinds of and what's needed to make that happen finally?
There's a lot of questions.
The future,
the future
is the key.
So I just met a NASA scientist who showed me how he factored in the butterfly effect into his hurricane model, and I was like, wait a minute, you can actually account for chaos. So I think the future is bright with respect to what we can factor in and analyze. So I am not at all pessimistic that literally everything under the sun is possible. If we can model chaos, then we're going to be good. I think the hype curve will flatten out. I think that I love the buzz. I love how much everybody cares about this and how much technology conversation there is. I think the good and the bad will start to separate itself, and people will start to see where we're wasting our energy on certain things and conversations and where we're really yielding real benefits for people. So I'm hopeful that will happen, because I really think that all of our collective energy is best spent on real problems that are intractable and not just improving the quality of a bike lane, another millimeter. I think that machine learning is probably going to accelerate at a rate that not a lot of us are ready to understand and process. So I think that that's a really great frontier that I'm excited to learn more about and learn how it's going to impact government, because I think it's going to be, what I'm hearing is that it's going to move really quickly and advance our practice a lot faster.
Cool. Any questions from the audience? Yeah, Tyler.
Just parlaying on that machine learning aspect, can you give for all of us that don't have a huge idea of what the heck you're talking about, give us an example of rubber hitting the road on machine learning actually delivering value to government and citizens?
I'm not an expert in it. I just talked to several people who. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So my background, my PhD is in sort of machine learning field, natural language processing. So in short, right, machine learning is taking a bunch of data and making. Yeah. The question is, where is machine learning actually? Where is rubber hitting the road on machine learning? So it's a way to. It's usually predictive modeling of some sort. Hey, we have all these inputs from all these places. What can a computer tell us is going to happen versus just sort of my insight or the statistics I'm doing. So sometimes that can be pretty complex. We're still very early, as was mentioned, but actually, if you take the example of that I just mentioned of Chicago and health inspections, actually that is a mathematical model. You could probably qualify it as maybe a form of machine learning where they're actually using inputs to direct and try to predict where to deploy resources. So I guess you'd have to ask someone here from Chicago if that's currently being used on the ground or not. I just read about it, but all right, it is. So there's a rubber hit the road example. We're early. As we get more data, more algorithms, more people who are educated in data and machine learning in the coming years, we'll see more of this. The balance is keeping things simple. You have this trade-off between complexity of a model and interpretability of the model, and no one wants a giant black box telling them where to spend all their money. But there are great algorithms out there that are much more interpretable as well. Maybe a little less powerful, but we can understand exactly what's going on under the box. So we'll see that trade-off over time.
Cool. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
As some of you alluded to already, implementing technological change is way easier than implementing cultural change from that technology. And so I guess I'd be curious from specifically a city perspective is like, what successful ways have you seen that you've been able to kind of like foment a cultural change based on the data? Like what's been a successful argument you've been able to make that's kind of had traction within city departments and been able to sell them on that idea?
That's a good question. I think one of the ones to talk about open data and tech group has really been pushing how can we use open data and get away from sort of foiling everything all the time. I just had a great incident about, not incident. I got an email from a CIO of an agency about 2 weeks ago saying, I've been sending this data to other agencies at 2 gigs a pop, and all I've been doing is FTPing this, and it's just killing our resources to do this. Can I put this on the open data portal and then just have everybody go to the portal, right? And so that seems particularly easy to do, but it took a while for people to understand that that was a culture shift to start putting stuff on the portal, so you increase functionality of your agency, not just because the law says you must, right? And we'll cart you off to open data jail or whatever.
If only. I'm kidding.
All right, I'm getting I'm getting the old finger over the throat, so I think we're out of time. Yeah? Can we bleed over? Yeah. Such a good conversation. Why don't we take one more question and then we'll go. Yeah, right there.
Spatial and non-spatial data. It sounds like there's a lot of spatial data that's being analyzed across really all 4 of you gentlemen up there. How are you marrying that non-spatial component with the spatial? And how is that helping to drive some of the analysis that you're seeing?
So I'll take 2 seconds and tell you that New York City has a particularly unique capability called Data Bridge, where we get spatial and non-spatial data, and internally within this capability, we actually run an algorithm that integrates that data across so that we have a better understanding of the places and spaces within New York City. So we get a lot of unstructured data coming in, and we have access to DOF, and DOB has spatial data. Obviously DOF handle stuff with regards to mortgage, so they have information on buildings and so on and so forth, tax information. And so we marry that together, and it's actually an algorithm that runs automatically. And so I like to call the data bridge sort of the
So why does that not make its way out, though?
I knew he was gonna.
Feel like we have the clean data.
But that's great.
It's a good question.
That
I'm
was
curious.
a good alley-oop, because we, when I came in and took office, one of the things was we need to actually run open data through Data Bridge. Before they were they are two separate systems. Now we're going to be working with agencies to put data into Data Bridge and push it out through the open data portal that way, so that it can be integrated, and then also that we can have those standards around geospatial information as well.
And I think it's important when doing spatial analysis. Like some data sets have longitude, latitude attached to it. That's not always important depending on what you're looking at, right? When I was looking at the histogram of health inspection scores, I wasn't doing it by location. So often the question is there something spatial, or is there a reason to use the spatial part of this story, of this data set? Does that further does mapping it tell me anything, or does it just make a clickable thing that looks cool, right? Sometimes it's the clickable thing that looks cool, people make maps. That doesn't necessarily get you very far. If you need to go per district of a legislator or something, then yeah, spatial data is important. But, and often you have these unique identifiers that allow you to join neighborhood. I'm lucky enough to be in New York City, where we have great spatial data released by the government, and we can join, by zip code or by council district or by state district. And so once you do this join, you're doing a mashup of your spatial analysis with any data set that has any identifier that tells you the school district, the police precinct, all can be joined. And at that point, you can do really cool stuff. So.
All right, with that, we're going to have to cut it off. Thanks so much for coming out. Thanks so much to our panelists. One last thing, so our panelists are here today, I think parts tomorrow for a lot of them. Find each other, talk to them. I'm going to ask a couple questions so that you guys can know who to talk to. If any of you actually use Python, R, SciPy, any MATLAB, or you know what these things are, can you just stand up? Okay, look at each other. These are your friends. These are people to talk to, like brainstorm. And anyone who's interested in kind of the product policy side, of kind of insight generation, can you all stand up? Okay, look around. These are the people you're going to introduce yourself to later on and chit chat over dinner. All right, thanks so much.